I'm speaking with Garth Ennis. We know him from Preacher and The Boys, and we're going to be talking about the Tankies. It just came out from Dead Reckoning. It's a new edition, beautiful, three stories in one book. And I wanted to talk to you, Garth, about the
Hmm.
writing process. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about war comics because I had the privilege of listening to a wonderful interview you did a while back where you talk about your influence with war comics at growing up. So
Right.
I'm thinking that might have been like the core that led to everything else in your writing.
I think it's a huge part of it. When I was a kid, I didn't have access to American superhero comics the way most people in the business did. I read two titles, both British anthologies. One was 2000 AD, which is a sort of science fiction action comic, and the other was Battle. And Battle was the best of the British war comics. And I think it was, I mean, I've talked about this before, but I think there was something in the understanding, even as a kid, that what I was reading about were stories and characters that were inspired by real life, by things that had happened, by things that people had done. Now, this, of course, is allowing for the hyperbole of even the best war comics of the era. But you do understand reading a story like, for instance, Charlie's War, about a boy soldier who arrives in the who joins the British Army in 1916 and arrives at the front just in time for the Battle of the Somme. You understand historically these things happened, and that there's a veracity to them in a way that the stories in 2000 AD or standard superhero comics just isn't there. And I think that's what drew me to war comics and kept me in war comics for so long. Um, Understanding that yes, as I say, these stories were based on actual events. That led me to an interest in military history, where I was reading, about those exact events. And then eventually, of course, when I started to write comics myself, that notion was never very far away. And so the whole thing came full circle, I suppose, as I started to do my own war comics. So I suppose you could say in a way that I'm just like everybody else. I'm recreating the stories I read as a kid. It's just that for me, they're different to everybody else.
Oh, sure, that makes total sense. I wanted to jump in with the main character, the glue that puts everything together, Styles. And
Mhm.
I don't think he even has a first name. I couldn't find it. Can you tell us the background to Styles? Because I
Mhm.
think you favor anti-heroes. He's not totally an anti-hero, but he's
Mhm.
certainly not likable.
No, he's a nasty, bad-tempered little bastard, but he is the guy you want in that situation. He's an absolute professional. Um, he knows the job. He knows the limitations of his own men, his own equipment. He knows the dangers of the job. He's sent in, as I recall at the start of the first story, to take over a tank who's lost its commander, and he has to take this rookie crew, and then some try to then catch up with the rest of the unit, which I don't think they ever actually do. They just sort of stumble around one of these Normandy battles, um, failing to join up with their unit. Styles, I think I wanted him to be a slightly larger than life character. He has this, he has a Geordie accent, which is an almost impenetrable accent, native to the town of Newcastle in the north of England. Um, he's There's an element of the grotesque about him. As I say, he is larger than life. He's this strange, uh, knobbly faced, ugly little man, permanently bad tempered. Carlos Esquerra, of course, did a wonderful job on Styles, really brought him to life. There's a cartoonish element to Carlos' character design that I knew I could rely on there. Um, so, of course, when I did the first story, I had no idea there was going to be a second. I hoped there would be, but because I wanted to do more with Styles. But in between the two stories, the Tankies and then the Firefly and His Majesty, I happened to be watching a documentary in which there was an interview with a World War II Geordie tank commander, which was a surprise to me. I mean, not that that such a man should exist, but just that I would be able to watch a documentary of what almost seemed like my character come to life. And in it, the guy relates an anecdote about, I think he was involved in one of the desert battles towards the end of 1941, and he said they'd had this terrible day. He said, we'd been killing people all day. I remember that was the phrase he used. And that after the action, the regimental padre came along and said, boys, tomorrow's Christmas, which they'd forgotten. I said, let's gather around and I'll say a prayer and we'll have some hymns. And he said, no thanks, Padre. That's me finished with God because of this hellish day he's had. And that's why in the second one, there's that scene that directly inspired a scene in the second one where Styles has no problem whatsoever in shooting up a church, in having a tank battle inside a church. And I think at one point when someone says, God, Sarge, isn't this a bit blasphemous? He says, I wouldn't know, I'm a pagan. All that came directly from that documentary. I suppose you could say that's one of those happy accidents.
Yeah, well, that answers a lot of questions right there. That's a wonderful answer you just provided. I was wondering about if it was a trilogy, it was meant to be one. Well, I guess that's where the magic of being a great writer comes in, because everything seamlessly fits together. I was going to ask you about, because you don't lead the reader by the hand necessarily. You don't have these mini profiles at the beginning of a lot of superhero comics, which I think have their place, but you just you bring up terms like HE. I didn't know what that was, or stonk, or hustlers, and you just assume the reader's going to figure that out, is going to look it up later.
Right. I mean, if the tank fires and there's a massive explosion, you can assume that when the guy said load HE, he meant high explosive.
Yeah.
For example, if shells are coming crashing down all around them and someone shouts about a stonk, you understand it refers to a barrage of some kind.
And I'm sure that's intentional, because you want to evoke this feeling of one thing happens, something stumbles and happens, and the chaos, the fog of war and all of that.
Yeah, and you want the reader to be kind of learning, picking up the patois as they go along, as they're kind of absorbed into the story. You want it to be a learning experience for them, initially disorienting and then slowly learning the ropes.
Well, in my review, I was fixated on the Geordie reference, because to me that's the crunchy goodness of a good story, where you have these things that a reader hooks into, like, what the hell's a Geordie? And I'm still not totally I still don't totally have a sense of what it is. I understand it's a regional, like a
Yes,
rivalry going on.
Yeah, it's as I said, it's from Newcastle in the north of England. I don't know why the accent ended up the way it did. I mean, I'm sure you could do a search on YouTube, Geordie accent or something like that, and you'll hear what it's like. But it is highly distinctive. I happen to like it quite a bit.
Oh yeah, I mean, it makes the reader work, but in an enjoyable way. It's like reading Crazy Cat in a little a little bit. And I love the afterword. Is the afterword something that you created especially for Dead Reckoning, or?
No, that appeared in the original Battlefields collections from Dynamite. We just amalgamated the three afterwards, in the same way as when Dead Reckoning did the collection of the Night Witches stories from Battlefields. We did the same thing there.
Okay, well,
but it's something I've always liked doing. I do it, in most of the war stories I write, just to kind of fill in a bit of historical background for people, so that they understand that, what's reality and what I've added in, if you know what I mean.
well, there's so much that a person interested in the craft of writing can learn from that afterward, because you do so much research. And one of the nuggets, one of the most interesting among so many things, is the concept of the citizen soldier, because you've got these young British guys who are going in, they can show valor, but they're not going to show fanaticism. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is something I've always found very interesting. Uh, in World War II terms, when we think about fanaticism, we tend to think of the some of the German troops who would go beyond the natural professionalism of that army into actual uh, death or glory behavior. The Waffen SS, most obviously the dedicated Nazis. We also think about the Russians, and we think about the Japanese with Banzai charges and so on. We don't tend to think so much about the British or the Americans when we talk about fanatical behavior, apart from the occasional individual. And yet, if you go back 20 years, you would have found, particularly in the British Army, an expectation of the men on behalf of the senior commanders, of exactly that kind of behavior. Men were required to climb out of trenches, go charging across no man's land directly into enemy fire, carry on no matter what awful losses they took, and seize the objective. Now, in the intervening 20 years, you have that generation of British soldiers from World War One coming home, the ones that actually did, coming back to a country that they'd been promised was a land fit for heroes, but was in actual fact riven with depression and industrial unrest and joblessness. Pretty miserable experience for them, considering what they'd been through for the 4 terrible years of the First World War. And I think that what this did was it bred in the subsequent generation an extreme cynicism about war, about the old myths of heroic behavior, of fighting for one's country, and so on. And the generation that took Britain through World War II were a good deal more dubious about that kind of behavior. They were professional, they did the job, but you saw relatively little fanatical behavior from them in the British Army, because their fathers had told them, listen, son, it's all lies. It's all shit. What they tell you you're fighting for, this notion of, the British Empire, the British nation, it's just guys like you dying for rich people. And while I think that generation, the ones that fought in World War II, recognized that Hitler had to be stopped, that Nazism, that Nazi Germany had to be defeated, uh, they weren't, it was not a grand and noble cause for them so much as it was just a job to be done. And that's what I try to reflect when I write characters like Styles and so on. These guys are good, they're hard-bitten professionals, but they're not maniacs. They're not, for instance, like the German officer who you see in the second story in the book, the King Tiger commander, who, in his own quiet and occasionally actually polite way, is a fanatic, is uh, a Nazi soldier, a man who, in his own words, has sworn to give his life for Adolf Hitler if necessary.
And that brings to mind the tanks. Now, the British and the Americans, they had relatively subpar tanks compared to the elite Nazi tanks. And I'm thinking, well, it's not the most original thought in the world, but it's maybe because it's reactionary. They're reacting to what's going on, so they're creating tanks that are standard issue that are going to do the job as well as possible. The Nazis are like on another level, right? Or
Well, yeah, it's two different philosophies, really. The Americans, in particular, with the Sherman tank, which is a perfectly serviceable, um, very reliable tank that does the job, and does it very well, and can be relied upon, isn't going to break down at awkward moments, isn't over engineered, isn't so heavy you can't get it across bridges, can be easily transported. What they have there is a great, you might say, universal tank. Now, if it comes face to face with some of the big German tanks like the Panther or the Tiger, it's probably going to be in trouble. But those German monsters, which did inspire a good deal of fear in their opponents, uh, those things, they were over engineered, they were needlessly complex, they were hard to move around, they couldn't be taken across a lot of bridges, and it was difficult to transport them by rail. they broke down a lot. They were not reliable, and there were always relatively few of them. And if you asked most Allied commanders whether they'd like to have, say, a battalion of usually functioning Sherman tanks, which would be reliable enough to take you through a battle, and you would be able to, you'd be able to, have a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen tanks that you could call on at any time, or half a dozen Tiger tanks that really are, you cannot rely on in the same way, that might break down, might collapse a bridge. You're probably going to find that those commanders would have said, no, we'll take the Sherman. Of course, if you asked the crewmen who actually had to go into battle with them, while they would have appreciated a tank that didn't break down, they would be constantly aware that if they got into a fight with a German tank, things might not go their way, and that could lead to sudden fiery and ghastly death. And so they would have had a completely different take on the tanks they were up against. It's not much consolation to you if your tank gets hit by a shell from a Tiger, knowing that eventually the Tiger will run out of ammunition or break down and be outflanked by the dozen other Shermans in your unit. That's not much consolation to you if you were the poor sod who met it first. So you have these different perspectives on the tanks and their designs. Ultimately, I think the Allied approach to have a great many of a good tank rather than a few of a particularly dangerous tank proved to be the deciding factor.
And then the Centurion emerges, but way too late.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the Centurion did eventually have its moment. It saw action all over the world in a variety of wars. And the one where it really excelled was in the Yom Kippur War, 30 years after the Second World War, when Israel found itself up against a sort of a double thrust from the Syrians in the north and the Egyptians in the south. And that was when the Centurion really came into its own and proved to be the excellent tank everyone had always suspected it was. It's just funny that a tank that was essentially built to fight the Tiger found its moment 30 years later.
Now, the third and last story is set during the Korean War. You could have easily had a World War II trilogy, but you made the decision to do the Korean War. Was that intentional? Do you think maybe the Korean War has somehow gotten lost, relatively lost?
Yeah. Yes, very much. So it seems to, I think one of the things that I say in the book is that it seems to forever sit in the shadow of World War II. It's 5 years later. Much of the equipment is the same. The tanks are slightly better. Jet fighters are starting to come in, but the infantryman carries the same equipment that he did 5 years earlier. The tactics aren't dissimilar. Even when we think about the way we remember and look at that war, most of the footage is in black and white, just like World War II, and it seems to somehow consign it to the exact same period of history. But the Korean War is often overlooked. The men who fought there, and I think 50,000 Americans were killed in that war. The men who fought there, people really aren't generally aware of what happened. And I think that was part of what drove me to make the third Tankies stories a Korean War story. I had actually intended to just leave it at the end of Firefly and His Majesty, but I think around that time I found myself doing a bit of reading about the Korean War, and especially the charge of the Centurion unit that went in to rescue the British soldiers from the hills when they were surrounded by the Chinese. And that seemed to me to have a kind of an epic quality, and it seemed to me that it would be a nice way to round out the Tanky style story, and also for him to work out a couple of demons of his own, I think, which he'd been left with after the first two stories.
Yeah, I think that's a very fascinating area to explore further. The Korean War, uh, it could have become World War III, as far as know. I'd have to really become more knowledgeable about it. But I mean, anything could happen. And
Well, yeah, I mean, when you consider that Russia certainly took an interest. We know now that they did supply fighter pilots to fly alongside the Korean and Chinese pilots, and in fact, American pilots realized that at the time because they got into dogfights with these guys and were able to look into the cockpit um, of the opposing aircraft and realize, well, hang on, that guy's not Chinese, that guy's not Korean. So the Russians were certainly taking an interest. The Chinese were directly involved. So all of a sudden you had America versus China. And I think that at one point, Douglas MacArthur, um, who was commanding the American forces in the war, wanted to use atomic bombs to stop the advancing Chinese army, which was the Chinese army was absolutely huge and had taken their involvement, had taken MacArthur by surprise. And pretty soon, Allied forces were in full retreat. And MacArthur was saying the only way to stop them would have been to use nukes. Um, it's I do sometimes think that had the bombs not been used at the end of World War II, you might have found them being used in Korea instead, where the results would have been vastly more catastrophic with more bombs used and more people dying. Because, of course, if they hadn't been used at the end of World War II, they wouldn't have been used in action before, and people wouldn't quite have it in their heads just how catastrophic these weapons could be. So, yes, it could have become World War III. It was, I think, careful management by all concerned that prevented it from doing so.
instead, it became the first modern limited war. And to Eisenhower's credit, at the end of his administration, his farewell address, he talks about warning people about the military-industrial complex, to his great credit.
Yes, it's ironic that the man who was perhaps the chief beneficiary of the military industrial complex, which gave him the weapons with which to fight World War II, uh, was the man who ended up warning us about it. But then I suppose it's the familiarity he had with the notion, having seen the military industrial complex in action as president, that would have, I think, given him the insight to afford us that warning. I also think that I believe he actually wanted to call it the military industrial congressional complex, but
Oh,
some speechwriter talked him out of it at the last minute. You know, it's like that's a dot you don't want to join, sir, if you know what I mean.
well, I wanted to just make clear to folks, if you love the boys, check out Garth Ennis titles over at Dead Reckoning. There's String Bags, Night Witches, and of course, what we've been talking about now, the Tankies, and they're all amazing war stories of uncommon stories. I mean, that's what you prefer, right,
Mhm.
Garth? Offbeat stories,
Yes,
nuggets of.
the ones that people don't necessarily know. Um, the night witches. I mean, I don't know how many people are aware that the Russians committed women to combat in World War II as pilots, medics, machine gunners, snipers, tank crew, pretty much everything. I mean, thousands upon thousands of women served in the front line, and the Night Witches was my first attempt to get that notion across.
Okay, well, I just wanted to keep it short and sweet. Thanks so much, Garth, for doing
Yeah,
this.
pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem at all. All right.